So I am very excited to welcome the amazing Carcamo to Schoolism. This is going to be a really fantastic opportunity for you and for me because I'm going to be taking a class with you guys. So watercolors with Carcamo, let's go.
My name is Gonzalo Carcamo. I'm a Brazilian artist best known for my watercolors. Here, I'd like to share with you some paintings, studies, and illustrations from my career. I usually only do simple line drawings, just to plan my composition, things like that. The rest of it, like a lot of the details, I just paint it. Sometimes, on some illustrations, I will use masking fluid, but on this one, I just used opaque white gouache. This is the paper that was dipped in tea. This is actual watercolor paper though, that's why I toned it. I needed the quality of the paper because that's very important. It's actually 300 grams, so 140 pounds. But it always has to be 100% cotton. For illustrations, I love using hot press paper, because cotton paper absorbs water at a degree that I think is ideal for watercolor. If you use a heavier paper, you need to use more water and more pigment. This one is about a selfish character from an Oscar Wilde story. You see, this environment is very arid and dry, which is just like the personality of this character. This is the cover of my book, but the image is actually the end of the story. Once you read the whole story, you'll learn why this tree is important. You see, this is another reason why it's important to use cotton paper, because cotton paper can stay wet long enough for you to create this kind of uniform, homogeneous wash. You have to plan very carefully for a piece like this, because you have to save the white of the paper. The lightest part has to be saved in watercolor, right? So planning is very important. This is from another one of my books that's not finished yet. I still have several in production. The story of this book will start on the cover. I try to avoid using opaque gouache and watercolor. I just do it sometimes to bring some of the light back into the painting, but mostly it's watercolor. You see this shadow here? It's the projected shadow of the wings of a bird, which is one of the main characters of the story. In Incan culture, white llamas are special, so when one is born, it's separated from the herd and kept for sacrifice. But this boy is saving this white llama by painting its fur dark so it won't be sacrificed. In these pieces, I tried not to use masking fluids or opaque colors. Instead, I tried to keep to the traditional methods of painting watercolor. You can kind of see it here. These white spots here are painted, but I preserved this area so the white is just the paper. A lot of it is just paper. These are just some quick studies, really loose, just for practice. Some of these studies are painted directly. I didn't do any line drawings for them first. Let me begin by talking about my watercolor techniques. There's a prejudice or a stigma about watercolor. People think that it's too difficult to work with or that it's for children. I think the fear that people have of watercolor comes from the fact that you can't make corrections unlike in oil or acrylic. In other techniques, if you're doing a landscape or a portrait, you have time to correct and rework your piece. Not so in watercolor. In watercolor, there's a limit to the corrections that you can make. So there's a lot more planning involved when painting in watercolor. For example, if you start a first pass with yellow, but then you decide, no, green would have been better, you have to start over. So there's a lot of thinking and planning before you actually start painting. You have to understand how the pigment behaves with the water so that you can control things like saturation and contrast. If you're working with a sepia color in oil, for example, and you want to make a gradation to white, you would just keep adding white to your mixture until you've got white. In watercolor, though, instead of adding more white, you would add water to dilute the pigment and get your gradation. The exercise you're going to do now is very important to understanding this behavior of watercolor. In oil, for example, the color that you mix on your palette is the color that will be on your canvas. Watercolor is not like that. You have to think logically when mixing watercolor paints, because when you have the pigment on your brush and you add another color, you won't see the difference. The paint won't be diluted, the color is going to look the same on your brush. You will only see the difference when you apply it to the paper. This exercise will help you understand how to achieve the saturation of watercolor that you want. You will learn how to control the saturation of the watercolor and learn just how saturated it can be, how you can make it super saturated or make it lighter. I believe one of the main advantages unique to watercolor is happy accidents, so one of the exercises that you will do is to help set yourself up to have these happy accidents. I know people who can mimic or copy oil paintings, acrylic paintings, gouache paintings, but there are no mimics or forgers of watercolor paintings because of these happy accidents. Not even the original artist can replicate one of their own watercolor paintings because those happy accidents cannot be reproduced. All the exercises that you will do will be so that you can build a repertoire of ways to encourage these happy accidents, so that you can call upon them when you're trying to get a specific result or effect in your watercolor painting. This repertoire wouldn't be on paper, but internalized in your mind so that you can call upon it and use it when you need it. Your watercolor paper can experience different degrees of wetness. When the paper is so wet that it's shiny, it'll respond differently to the watercolor pigments than it would if it was dry. The paint will expand a lot more on wet paper. When the paper is less wet and more opaque, there will be a lot less expansion of your paint. When the paper is dry, your brush strokes will have hard edges. This first exercise will be a monochromatic one, just to help you grasp how the pigment works with the water. I don't want you to mix colors yet, just keep things simple, so first you'll learn how to make a color more or less saturated. The first exercise is going to show you how to make a color dark to light. The next one will be from light to dark. You'll work on those variations to practice how to control that aspect of watercolor. The art supplies that you use are very important. If you practice on low quality paper, you won't be able to transfer what you learned to higher quality professional grade paper because those papers behave differently. Generally speaking, professional grade watercolor paper is 100% cotton. 140 pounds is the highest weight I think suitable for these exercises. Watercolor paper comes in 3 different textures. Hot press has a very smooth surface, which I think is suitable for illustrations and work that has a lot of detail. I love the way the paint spreads and stains this type of paper. Hot press is also suitable for you to use other techniques over top of your watercolor when you're done. But unfortunately, people often think it's too difficult to work with hot press paper. As you can see, cold press paper has more texture to it. I usually do more fine art with it because I can paint faster brush strokes on it, which takes greater advantage of the textures of the paper. There's another type of paper called touchon that I like, which is even more textured. I recommend that you try several different papers to determine how much texture you prefer. Also, this way you can learn what kind of results you can expect when you paint on them. This is a petit gris brush. It's made especially for watercolor using squirrel hair. The key characteristic of squirrel hair that makes it ideal for watercolor is that it can carry a lot of water. It can also maintain a fine tip so you can paint very thin lines with it, as well as thick strokes, of course. You can also use Kolinsky or sable brushes to paint in watercolor, but this squirrel hair brush is quite versatile, so you can do a whole painting using just this brush. The major brands of watercolors such as Schmincke, Winsor Newton, Sennelier, etc. all have a student line and a professional line of watercolors. You can start with the student line to do your first works. But once you start using the professional lines of watercolors, the difference will be very noticeable because the professional lines of watercolors have much more pigment in them. Cotman is the student line from Winsor Newton. The number on the tube indicates the amount of pigment it contains. Now, since these are all student line watercolors, they're all Series 1. The professional grade paints have higher numbers, and the higher the number, the more pigment there is. This is a tube of paint from Winsor Newton's professional line. You can see here it's Series 4, so the higher number means it contains more pigment than Series 1. People often ask me if it's better to use solid paints like what we have over there, or paints from tubes. The quality of the pigment is the same in both. With solid paints though, because it's hard and requires water to dissolve it enough to transfer the pigment to your brush, it takes more effort to use and will wear your brush down faster. Paint from the tube is fluid but thicker. It has more viscosity. And because it's thicker and more viscous, it protects the brush in a way against friction, so your brush will last a lot longer. So that's it for the art supplies. In this first column, I'm going to start with the most saturated color. And then slowly, I'm going to add water until I have a nice gradation right down to the white of the paper. So in the beginning, don't worry if your gradation doesn't reach all the way to the bottom of the page, or if the reverse happens where you get to the bottom and you're still not at white yet. You're learning to control the gradation now, but it takes time and experience to master it. There's a lot of pigment here, so this is going to be the darkest color, which I'm going to grade slowly to white by adding water to it. Now you'll notice that even though I'm adding water, there's not much difference in the color on my palette. When you do the next brush stroke, just touch the brush along the bottom of it gently. Gradually, the water will run slowly down due to gravity and pull the pigment down with it. Now don't smear your brush. It has to be one smooth stroke. The water will connect your strokes. Now I'm gradually adding water to the palette. The accumulation of water at the bottom of every stroke is very important, because that's what will connect one brush stroke to the next. This is why we need the incline, so the gravity can pull the water down. So that was the first exercise. The next column will be the reverse. You're going to start with water and gradually add pigment until you go from white to the most saturated color at the bottom. This requires more careful planning. Not controlling the amount of pigment you're adding to each stroke, because if you're not careful and consistent, you won't end up with your darkest color at the bottom, it'll be in the middle somewhere. So you have to always keep in mind that your goal is to finish with the most saturated color at the end. The first brushstroke is just water. Then gradually you're going to add more pigment. If you put too much, the gradient will become too abrupt. So you have to control the intensity of your paint and keep checking your palette. With this exercise, don't worry too much if your results aren't the same as mine. The important thing is for you to familiarize yourself with how the paint behaves. When I'm finished at the bottom, I use a drier brush to soak away the extra water. Otherwise, the paint will start going back up the paper due to capillary action. This was an accident, the lightening of the stain down here at the bottom, but it's something that you can add to your toolbox of accidents to apply in the future when you actually need it. This next exercise will be about controlling the amount of pigment you're using. So what you're going to do is start off dark at the top, make a gradient to white in the middle, then a gradient to dark again to the bottom. This is going to push you to add more water faster than in the first exercise because your gradient will be going to white in half the time. This will help you practice controlling the intensity of the pigment. So this will start at the same saturation as the previous exercise, but this time I'm adding more water per brush stroke. There are two things that you have to balance here. The first is logic, how much water you should add to get the effect that you want. The second is observation, is what you thought would happen actually what's happening, and if not, what adjustments do you need to make? By constantly balancing your logic and your observation, you will guide your work to the result that you want. So, not much pigment in the middle. Now I start darkening again. Well, that's because the sponge absorbs water faster than the napkin. Now don't worry too much if the lightest part is a little high or a little low on the page. Again, this exercise is just to help you get used to how the paint behaves. Doing these exercises in watercolor is like practicing scales in music. I hope these exercises will help you gain confidence when you go to work on a real painting, because confidence makes all the difference. It's like learning to ride a bike. You don't start on a bike by going full speed. You have to start slowly and then gradually speed up. This last exercise is the opposite of the previous one. You're going to start with white, then go to dark, then back to white again. The accumulation of water with each brushstroke is very important because that's what connects your strokes together into a gradient with smooth transitions. Now that I've reached the most saturated part, I'm going to start adding water to lower the saturation to white again. These exercises are just an approximation to help you understand how the pigments are behaving with the water.
Okay, so that was lesson 1. Now it's time for the homework. You're going to be doing the gradients, the 4 different gradients, and you're going to do it 5 times minimum. You want to get it as smooth as possible, so good luck.
As you can see, this is a very simple, basic sketch. I'm not establishing the shadows in it, just the large masses. The idea for this study isn't for you to have a finished piece at the end that you can put on your wall. It's so that you can have this experience and keep it on your mind as you learn. A lot of students freak out when they think they've made a mistake in their painting. They want to throw it out and start over, but I tell them the mistakes aren't important. It's a learning experience. Out of everything that you're doing in the study, forget your mistakes and focus on the parts that you do like. That's enough. The learning experience is gradual, so it's good that you're doing exercises and having a few successes along the way. What matters here is that you're accumulating experience while painting with watercolor. I think the challenge for you using watercolor will be learning to accept happy accidents as part of your work. So don't go crazy trying to correct every little thing. That's not what watercolor is about. So to begin, the first stage is planning. Before I begin, I always analyze the photo and plan how I'm going to paint. The first step is to identify and remember which parts have the most light. So a spot like this, for example, these are the parts that I have to remember to preserve and not paint over because I want to keep the white of the paper for my lighted parts. So you can see in terms of the gradation from light to dark, this would be the lightest part, then this, then here, and so on. For example, the sky is light, but the leaves are dark. You don't have to paint the two separately. Instead, paint the whole sky, this entire area over here. Then, because the leaves are darker, we can paint them over top of the sky. Keeping in mind the exercise we were doing before, this tree will be the darkest, so it will have the most pigment. And then here, 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 and here, and here. These will be the darkest parts of the painting. Now I'm going to start painting the sky. The intensity of the watercolor will fade as it dries, so eventually the colors will be a lot lighter than they are right now. Sometimes I like to use faster brushstrokes to take more advantage of the texture of the paper. Now, just because happy accidents are a big part of watercolor, that doesn't mean you can only do your painting once, and that's it. Whatever you've got is there forever. You can still make corrections if you want to. For example, if you think this is too dark, you can use a napkin to remove some of the pigment as long as it's still wet. I want to use water as a tool too. I can add a bit of water and spread it around here to give the feeling of a sandy texture for the beach. To get these spots of light on the wall over here, I have to paint with the paper dry, because the shadows of the leaves have hard edges, see? If the paper's wet, the watercolor will blend together, so I have to paint on dry paper. So now I'm adding in leaves and other details over here, but I'm not painting every leaf or every branch. I just want to give the impression or the sensation of color here, so I'm going to keep it loose. Even though I'm painting from a photo of my own work, I can't do the same thing twice, so the two finished paintings might be similar, but they won't be the same. So since I'm working from light to dark, I'm not worried about establishing edges here because this part is lighter than this part. I'm going to paint everything first, then because the tree is darker, I can paint it over top. All of this is a matter of experience, the way you break down how you want to paint. As you learn, your experience will tell you which part to paint next. Usually, artists with a background in drawing tend to grab the brush near the tip like a pencil and try to do very precise lines. I suggest that you hold your brush closer to the end so that you can have looser brush strokes and lighter movement. The way the water spreads the paint is going to imply nuances of color and the different lighting on the leaves here. The variations in the water cause each brushstroke to leave a slightly different stain. So instead of painting one leaf one color and another leaf another color, this variation suggests different lighting from one area to the next. In watercolor, this is the unpredictability, the happy accidents I talked about. This is what you want. As you're painting, keep in mind how much of a particular value you're going to use. For example, I know that these walls will be the same, so I take care to mix enough paint to do this whole area. Otherwise, if I mix paint to do one part, then mix more to do another part, it's going to become very difficult to reproduce the same color, and my lighting will become inconsistent. So now, I'm just projecting the shadow of the leaves on the wall. And here's the light breaking through the shadows. Of course, it's not going to be the same as in the reference, but that's okay. And since the window over here is much darker than the wall, I can ignore it for now because I'll just paint it over top later. The paint has to be dry for me to paint on top of it. Otherwise, if I paint on it while it's still wet, the paint is going to bleed and spread. You can see that some bleeding of colors has already happened. It wasn't intentional, but I have to live with it because it's part of the work. These accidental things are all part of watercolor. You can see that even though this brush is very thick so I can make big brush strokes with it, I can still also do very thin lines. At this stage, I prefer your exercises to be based on another watercolor painting, because that painting has already simplified a lot of information for you. This way, you can get used to the simplification and experience the translation of a painting. Later on, you can grab a photo and paint from that, but you have to learn and build up to that. If you start from a photo without first learning to simplify in your head, you'll be distracted by all the little details and have an urge to paint them all. Notice how all my brushstrokes have a direction to them. This is because I want to imply a direction of my lights and shadows. This is not about reproducing what's in the picture, it's about giving the impression of the shape. So I want my brushstrokes to express the direction of my shadows to give them uniformity. It's about the sensation of forms, not about the forms themselves. It's more important to capture the sensation of light than to make the correct details of shapes. If you lose the light, that would be very hard to recover from. So, worry about capturing the light first before capturing shapes. When your brush is a little drier, you can take more advantage of the texture of the paper. You can see here this is a very light brush stroke. I want to simulate texture here using my brush strokes. Since it's dry in this area, I can work on this part that's more saturated. I want to communicate that there's some transparency in the leaves overhead here. I can use the water that remains on the paper to help me channel the pigment where I want it to go. Watch. I can put down a bit of water, add some pigment, and the water will spread the pigment for me. Some people paint something like this in watercolor and they want to paint the leaves one or two at a time. The problem with this is that by the time they get to the other end of the painting, half the leaves will be dry. So I prefer to keep the wetness of the paper consistent throughout this entire area so I can work this whole part together. It's important to work in the saturation that you intend to finish with. This way, you won't have to come back and apply more color on top of it later. If you want to reduce the amount of water on your painting, just dry your brush a bit and touch the tip of it to the water on your paper and the brush will soak it up. This will help prevent the paint from spreading more than you intend it to. There are fewer leaves in this painting than there are in the reference, but that's okay. I'm just trying to capture the sensation of the leaves and the light shining through. The actual amount of foliage is not that important. The paper's still wet, so when I put more pigment on it, you can see that it's spreading instead of making a brush stroke with hard edges. This gives the feeling of three-dimensionality with different shapes and colors. So this variation creates the illusion of different lights and different shapes. Now I'm going to dry this side here. Usually there's more wind when I'm painting outside, so paintings tend to dry faster. Now I can paint the darkest part. Because my background is already finished, I can paint over top of it with the darkest color. Over here in the corner, there's a woman bathing her child. Now, I'm not concerned about expressing this with a lot of details, I just want to communicate it with some clear shapes. And remember, this is just a study, so you're just doing an exercise. This is just to represent the lighting of the reference. I'm not trying to copy it, this is just a study of the lighting. See the wetness of the paper now? If I apply color now, I'm going to create a lot of areas of fusion instead of having hard edges. So with watercolor, it's important to understand how to use the dryness of the surface to your advantage. I have to change my brush. I need a smaller brush to paint the light coming through the floorboards here. For works like this, I prefer not to use masking fluids to preserve the light. Instead, I try to put in extra effort to plan my painting and preserve the white of the paper. Don't worry too much about achieving the exact results that you expect. Unpredictability and happy accidents are an essential part of watercolor. They're what make watercolor fun. Over here, I have pencil line work on my paper for where the steps will be, but that's just a guide. I don't have to follow these lines exactly. The pencil lines don't define the shape of the steps, only the paint does. I don't really like the line work of the steps, so I'm going to paint over it in a way that best suits the rest of the painting. I can do that because the line work is just a guide anyway. Notice that as the paint dries, it also gets lighter in color. See the colors fading? Although this part of the wall is in shadow, I know that the window will be a little bit lighter, so I'm painting it right now because the paint will fade and lighten up as it dries. You can see that a lot of unexpected, happy accidents are happening while I'm painting. I'm trying to incorporate them into my work. There's a bit of fusion happening here on this part of the roof. I'm going to try to correct this a little by putting a bit of water on it to break up the paint. The water is dissolving the paint that was dried here before, so now I get the soft edges on the roof that I wanted. It's important to stay aware of the wetness and dryness of the various parts of your painting in order to avoid unwanted accidents. You don't want to put your hand on a part that's still wet and cause your colors to bleed into one another by mistake. You can see how light it got after it dried. Now I'm going to go over it and add the darkest parts of the window and all the darkest details. When you start painting with watercolor, it's important for you to learn to build your painting up from light to dark, and to identify those parts in your reference. Of course, as you learn more and more about watercolor and get more experienced with it, you can start to bend or even break those rules. I don't like to teach norms of watercolor. I would never tell you that this or that is the correct way to paint with watercolor. I don't believe that there are rigid rules, there are just the various processes. So this is just one possible process, it just happens to be mine. You'll notice that I'm not trying to make a perfect copy of the photo, so I'm not super attached to all the details. In this study, I'm just trying to capture the lighting. Although there's a difference between what is here and what is there, I prefer to keep everything connected. So instead of trying to cut everything and putting hard edges everywhere, this way it'll feel more integrated. The fusions of color that you get in watercolor is what makes watercolor unique compared to other mediums. So I try to encourage these fusions as much as I can. It's nice to have reference for watercolor painting, but that's just the starting line. It's not the finishing line. Once you're finished your painting, for all intents and purposes, the reference no longer exists. What exists now is just your painting, no more, no less. This is just to provoke the result out of you.
Okay, so that was lesson 2. And I hope you had a lot of fun. Now it's your turn. You're going to be doing the homework and you're going to be painting monochromatic paintings, copying the master, Carcamo. Have fun.
In this next exercise, you're going to think more about color in your painting. This isn't really a reduced palette. It's a palette with a reduced intensity of colors. This is a way of exercising the eye, because, as you can see in the photo, there aren't any pure colors here. People see that the leaves here are green, so they think they can just pick up the green and start painting. But no, you have to mix it with a little bit of ochre to get that color. You can see that you have colder shadows here on the left side, but you also have warmer shadows here because of the reflected light coming off the ground. These colors all have variations in temperature. Think of the shadows not as being solid, but as being areas that are less illuminated. Personally, to achieve the shadows, I like to mix ultramarine blue with sepia and Van Dyke. Van Dyke is a brown color, more like sepia, burnt sienna, burnt umber. Van Dyke is a warmer color, and ultramarine blue is a colder one. So when you mix the two of them together, you get a color that can be either warm or cold. So if I want a warmer shadow, I use more Van Dyke, and if I want a cooler shadow, I use more ultramarine blue. This gives me more integrated shadows than simply using varying degrees of black. I do use blacks, but sparingly. I use it on special occasions, you could say, but not usually directly on the painting. The reference has a much less saturated color palette. So the process here is like what you were doing before, which is analyzing the reference to identify which are the lightest, most illuminated parts, so that you can preserve that area of your painting. In this painting, this color will be the clouds, which aren't pure white, just to reduce the amount of white in the sky. They do have a bit of tone to them. The whitest parts will be where there is more reflected light, like here on the wall. It adds warmth to the light on it. I can go over where the tower is because it's darker there, so I can add that over top later. Right now, I can use this blue to paint the whole sky. I'm avoiding painting this area right now, and I'm going to leave some clouds under it, so this yellow will also be the clouds. The shadow over here is cooler, so I can paint blue over it. That's okay. Here, if I feel like I've lost some of the cloud in the back, I can always add a bit of water to open that up and make it whiter. I'm not painting the tree here just yet because it's dark. That will come later. I'm going to paint the ground as if it's all illuminated by the same lighting. I'll go over it and add shadows later. By controlling the intensity of the green, I can use green as well to keep everything integrated. I'm going to try to simulate the small amount of green over here. But I'm keeping in mind that this green here is illuminated and that I'm going to add shadows over it later. People sometimes forget that the color will fade as it dries, so even though this looks very dark right now, it won't later. Once all this is dry, you'll see that it's a lot lighter. If I think this color's too intense, I can paint over it with water and that'll lighten it up. What's important is to observe what I'm doing to keep the richness of the tones. So here, I just waited for it to dry a little bit before painting over the distant hills. You don't have to copy the reference here. See, what I did was I made it a little bit lighter so that you can get a better perspective. I want to create a sensation of going more into the back. Over here, the light is bouncing off the floor and into the shadows under the overhang, which makes the shadows warmer. So there's a warmer shadow on top, but a cooler shadow below. I'm not trying to replicate all the details here. I'm just trying to communicate the sensation of those shadows by using warm and cold variations. So I don't worry too much about carving out all the shapes, or about the fusion that's happening over here. I just want to give the sensation of color, that's all. I can paint the building wall with a cold color now because the rock wall is a warm color. Since the paint is still wet, the edges are fusing together. I don't want to wait for my brushstrokes to dry. This is a choice. I don't want the hard edges here, that's why I'm painting while it's still wet. If I wanted defined edges, I would wait for the paint to dry first before painting over it. But I didn't want a hard line separating this wall from the building in the back. See, you have the information of the stones here, what their texture is like, what their shape is like, etc. So there's no need for me to paint all the individual stones. I'm just going to represent some of those. This is where water should be your ally. Now I'm putting a bit of color on the walls. I have the vegetation in the back here, so I just want to imply the white on this wall. That's why I put a bit of warm color on it. Remember where I painted earlier and it looked too saturated when it was wet? It's a lot lighter now that it's dry, so now it fits. It's funny how sometimes in my demo it looks like I did something that ruins the painting, and it looks like it can't be fixed, but then later, once the paint dries, it works out. It's like magic. So at this point, hopefully you're grasping the intricacies of painting with watercolor, mixing color and applying it and thinking about the final result of it. Proper planning and understanding pays off much more than just grabbing some paint and applying it. This way, your final result is much more vibrant and cohesive. The first thing I do is analyze the reference. What areas are receiving light? Which areas are the most illuminated? That's where I start, the light to dark. Now that I've painted in the side of this building, I can paint in the trees. I couldn't do that before because I didn't have a point of reference, but now I do, the building, right here. In my initial plan, I decided that the main part of the painting will be this area in the middle. That's why I'm saturating this part. The rest will be a bit more faded to guide the viewer's eye to the part I want them to pay attention to. I'm trying to represent the impact of the light in the bell tower. I'm putting a warmer tone on the inside because light is projecting out, reflecting off the floor and bouncing up to the ceiling. It's not a detail of form, it's a detail of sensation. I'm also working on the reflected light here. I had to overcome a lot of obstacles learning to paint in watercolor. There was a lot of trial and error. I don't think so because, in the end, the key to watercolor is the relationship between the water and the pigment, and that's very well known. My palette might be different, but I think other artists probably work similarly. So any differences between me and other artists happen naturally. I didn't purposely try to be different. Teaching classes now, I try to make things easier and clearer for my students. For example, I teach them about the quality of materials because when I started, I didn't know the importance of using good quality art supplies. I only discovered the difference the hard way later. I don't believe that being self taught is a privilege. I don't feel most self taught artists are self taught by choice. I've noticed that when a self taught artist has to learn something new, they're often resistant because they've been figuring things out on their own up until then. So they don't know how to take instruction. Of my students, I think the self taught ones have the most difficulty accepting new processes or new ways of doing things. You can learn a lot of bad habits and accidentally reinforce them when you're learning on your own. And it's harder to unlearn a bad habit and replace it with a new habit than to learn a good habit from the beginning. I can represent the stones by removing pigment. I prefer to do that instead of applying an opaque color over top, so I'm just wetting my brush and breaking the pigment and then drying with the napkin. I always compare painting to music. For example, you can play the guitar very well, but when you go to a violin, you have to make adjustments. In a lot of ways, even though you have strong musical ability in general, you're still going back to the beginning when playing violin. It's the same when you're strong in oils and acrylics, but have to switch to something like watercolor. I personally feel that it takes more effort to understand the nuances and peculiarities of the watercolor process, because it's so different from other painting techniques. So it's like you're still playing music, but you're using a different instrument. Now, after working on all the light forms, I'm going to put in the shadows. So now you can see why I painted everything in the same lighting. Because after I put the shadow in on top of it, I can use these fast brush strokes, so it looks like dapples of light showing through the shadows. I'm going to stop here so that I can maintain this as just a study of a controlled process. I could keep going, but I don't think it's going to add much to the painting, so I'm just going to leave it.
Okay, so that was lesson 3. Now you've graduated. Now we're going to be working from a photo. You're going to choose your photo, a muted color photo, and remember to simplify. Good luck.
This exercise involves a lot of resources and tools for producing illustrations. I use a lot of different tools, like masking fluid and a grease pencil in creating these illustrations. I'm going to apply this on the paper, which will make it impermeable. This way, when I paint over it, the areas I covered will not absorb water. Now, I'll show you how to use this pencil. You can also draw with this, and when you paint over it, water will be wicked away from where you drew. The pencil integrates the white better than painting over the same area with opaque paint. So here we have the masking fluid, which is more precise. What's interesting about this masking fluid is that it has a bit of color so you can see what you're drawing. There are some masking fluids out there that are white, which makes it a bit harder for you to see where you applied it. Be careful though. If you use the masking fluid directly on the brush and use it to draw, it'll ruin the brush and you'll lose it. So dip your brush in soap and cover it completely. Then remove the excess soap from the outside of the brush. Now you can draw with the masking fluid. I lost a lot of brushes before I discovered this trick. It's helped save my students' brushes too. Now immediately after using the masking fluid, wash your brush. Now you can use it again. The masking fluid has to be very dry for you to paint over it. Remember, when you use a dryer, it's important that you wait for the paper to cool down afterwards, because if you don't, when you apply the watercolor, the heat from the paper will cause your water to dry too fast. I can paint over it now. This is just a quick demonstration of how masking fluid works. Masking fluid allows you to make very delicate lines. You can even write a poem or something, paint over it, then remove it with your finger. It's like liquid rubber. You'll notice that when you remove the masking fluid, it'll leave lots of hard edges, but that works very well for this illustration. So these are a couple of important resources that can give you some shortcuts for working on complex paintings in the future. The idea behind this exercise is, when you're painting a scene with characters walking in a park or doing some activity, you have to present those characters within the context of the entire scene. This means you can't focus too much on details. Instead, you have to focus on expressing the lighting. This way, if you're not distracted by details, you can do a lighter figure on the painting, which is the main objective of the scene. The idea is to not get caught up in details. Establish a figure to capture the light and the shapes, but it won't be the focal point of the painting. This way, if you don't add many details, it'll remain a lighter part within the context of the painting. The idea here is the same. Preserve the area receiving the most light. But in this case, I'm also going to blend parts together using fusions. I want to encourage that fusion so that it can connect the different colors. I want them to fuse and bleed together. This is why it's important that I use a lot of water here. I don't want any hard edges in this painting. I want everything to connect to everything else because this will make the figure lighter. I'm not worried about maintaining the borders between colors because I want them to be connected. Also, if I put reflected light in the shorts, it'll make the image richer. Don't worry about the bleeding. This exercise will help you let go of the line work and allow the stain of paint to form the figure using shape and light. I'm painting the legs here at the bottom of the dress, but leaving some space in between just in case I don't want the fusion to be too long. I can always connect it later so that the fusion is more controlled. Don't worry about the bleeding, it's all part of the process of interpreting the figure. I can add details on the clothes using water. That bleeding is very common in watercolor. It won't ruin the painting. The first stage of painting here was just to capture the light. Now, in the second stage, I can start applying the shadows. It's just a suggestion of the figure. The beautiful thing about watercolor, I think, is that as much as you try to plan out your painting, things will never go completely to plan. So when I paint, I always try to go in a path from light to dark. This way, even if my plan goes off course, I still have a solid direction to move in. See, the colors are connected and transforming. Adding these extra details and information won't make the illustration better. This might be a resource for you to use if you're doing illustrations or a comic, something like that, making a piece that doesn't rely on line work, and because of that, it can integrate better into the context of your scene. This would be a great way to introduce watercolor to people who are already illustrators because this exercise forces them to surrender their line work in favor of working with the stain of the paint and the shapes that the paint takes on the painting. I would recommend that artists create their own books of reference. You can always keep doing these studies. The first step would be doing the studies using line work. The second step would be doing them without line work and just going straight to watercolor. In this exercise, you don't need the line work to show the image. I'm drawing the figure here and considering the masses of light on it. When I'm painting the face, I need to use a lot of water to keep the paint from drying too fast and imprinting on the paper. When using opaque mediums like, say, a canvas, you have to use more pressure. With watercolor, though, you should use a lighter brushstroke because it takes very little pressure to stain the paper with paint. Can you see how much water is still on my paper? This way, I can always come back later and apply more paint, for example at the top there near the torso. When you press too hard, the water will all accumulate at the end. That's totally normal. You'll get better at that with time and experience. What I did here is enough to represent the figure. I could keep going at it, adding more details like the fingers, but that would just make my painting look more and more like a photo, which is not what I'm trying to do. See? I'm just connecting the head with the shirt here. And that's all I need to do to represent the figure. It's usually important for me to control the intensity of the color, but in this case, I want to emphasize letting go of the need to stick to your line work. Or, to be more precise, focus on how you want to communicate your work as a whole and not on the little details. Now this exercise will help you practice controlling the intensity of the paint. You don't want the watercolor to bleed, so you have to add less water to the mix this time. So just a few brushstrokes here on the lady's purse. There, that should communicate the form nicely. On this other figure, you can ignore the shape of the shirt and just focus on the projected shadows. It's more important to consider the light on the figure. I'm focusing here on bringing across an overall feeling, so everything I'm doing is to create that suggestion and first impression to the viewer. When I'm trying to suggest at something, that means I paint lighter than I normally might do. When you see something epic for the first time, like for example the Grand Canyon or a giant redwood tree, there's that initial impact that makes you go, whoa. You don't get that feeling from details, you know? You get that sensation of epicness from seeing the whole thing. That's what I'm going for. The wow that you can only get from a first impression. When you see Notre Dame for the first time, you're impressed by the whole thing. You'll see the details later on, of course, but the initial impact, you never forget that. Here you can see two people walking. You can see that she has a lighter shirt, but you can't see details on it. But you don't need to. You already have the idea, the movement, and you have a good sense of what's going on. All the information that you need is there already. If you keep comparing your painting to your reference, you'll just keep finding little details that aren't quite the same, and probably you'll feel an urge to add them or fix them without thinking that those details won't enhance the beauty of your painting at all. So ideally, once you've captured the big ideas of your reference, I would want you to set it aside as soon as possible. There's always this epic drama at play when an artist decides when to call a painting finished. Because you can always add more details if you wanted to, in that sense, an artist never really finishes a work, they just stop working on it. These exercises will help instill in you the maturity as an artist to decide when to stop. Experience will inform you when you should stop. This will also set you apart from other artists because all artists tend to stop at different points of creating. Style is a glamorous way of talking about habits. When you see a painting, you can identify the artist because every artist expresses themselves in a certain unique, individual language that started as a series of habits when they were learning, which eventually became their style. So anything that you do regularly will become your style and your identity as an artist. So it's important to keep studying and to keep learning so that you don't always rely on those habits because that's when they become bad habits. In other words, for a lot of artists, their style becomes basically their answer for how to draw a face every time instead of reanalyzing new situations and lighting and adapting. This is why I believe life drawing is the best experience, because it always forces you to refresh the way you see and analyze things. So actually doing this exercise isn't hard. It's just the simplification process beforehand that requires a lot of thought.
Okay, so that was lesson 4. That was really, really fun. Figures, characters, Remember to constantly think about the overall picture and when to leave your painting, because I know I stayed on my painting a little too long. Have fun, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.
So first, I'm using this grease pencil to mark the areas that are white in the reference. What I'm doing right now is analyzing the reference to identify which areas will receive more light and shadows and planning my painting. When you're using things like masking fluid or a grease pencil, you have to do so very carefully and thoughtfully because otherwise, it would be very tempting to just start using it everywhere you see white in your reference, which will make your final painting very monotonous and boring. The leaves and tree trunks are very saturated and dark, so I can ignore them for now. I'm going to start by painting the sky, and I'm not going to reserve space for the trees. I'm just going to paint over the entire sky, and later I can paint the trees over top of it because they're darker. Right now, this color looks too dark, but it will fade as it dries. I'm also not worried that this color is going to fade too much either, because the light from the sky is reflecting on the roofs and on the ground, so I have to reserve those areas anyway. Now I'm going to paint the foliage in the back that's receiving light. But first, I have to dry the paper a little bit, because if I paint now, the stain will spread too much. So now the water on the paper has been reduced a little bit. Be bold. Try to avoid small brush strokes. I need to add a bit of water on my mixture because the pigments are very dense. But this helps me create nice textures. You can see how vibrant the colors are that are already there. I keep mixing the paint to create different greens, which makes the color richer. First, I was painting the parts that are receiving more light. Now I'm painting the parts in the shadows. I have used salt before, sometimes for illustrations to create texture. The only thing is, salt absorbs water and leaves residue when it dries. When you put salt on watercolor, it'll absorb the water, but the residue will get stuck on the paper, so you have to remove it afterwards. It does create a nice effect sometimes, though. I've used candle wax before, which is kind of like using the grease pencil. I believe John Singer Sargent used to use candle wax for masking because they didn't have masking fluids back then. I don't usually use anything like that, but I know there are some products that you can use to protect watercolor, just like how you use varnish for gouache. I'm trying to paint everything in the back first. I can paint the parts that are behind the dark parts of the trees because I can paint over that later. But the bottoms of the trunks are more illuminated, so I won't be able to paint that over, so I have to preserve those areas. In those cases, I could use masking fluid to protect the bottoms of the trees, but then I'll get hard edges when I remove the mask, which I don't want, so I'm avoiding that and doing this the old-fashioned way. The light source is coming from the right side of the photo. So you can see how illuminated the right side of everything is. But I'm going to paint everything as if there was no shadow first. You can see that there's some dirt at the base of the trees. I'm going to paint that as if it was all being illuminated by the light. I could wait for the dirt and the grass to dry so that when I paint the concrete part, there will be hard edges, but I prefer to connect it when it's wet. All these colors bleeding into each other will be a good overall look. Painting as if everything's illuminated will make things easier when I apply the shadows over top later. All this information of varying colors, the warmer parts, the cooler parts, the brighter parts, etc., all that information is going to be underneath the shadows in the end. I put a warmer color on this part of the trunk here because of the bouncing light hitting the tree. So this looks kind of chaotic right now, but I already know what the next steps are. It's already planned. Well, my fundamental thought is always, what is the lightest part and what is the darkest part? I also try to think what parts I can overlay because I'm always trying to maintain the longest, most fluid brushstroke possible. That means instead of painting two short strokes with a gap in the middle for a tree or something, I think, can I make one long brushstroke and then simply paint the tree over top of it later? So that's basically how I control the light in my work. So where do I have to preserve the white? And which parts can I paint first and add other structures over it later? Now, later, if I find that I don't have the contrast in my painting that I need, I can always adjust it. That's why I try to analyze my reference constantly to determine how I should proceed next with my painting. Otherwise, if you just pick apart and start painting without thinking about your painting as a whole, you're going to finish with a disjointed collection of small separate parts instead of a coherent piece of art. I'm always checking which parts have the most contrast, which part is darker, which is lighter. The road is lighter, things are darker on the trunks, and then the highlights on the trunks are lighter than the rest of the trunks. They're even lighter than the road in the back, and so on and so on. I'm always comparing the contrast. For example, I'm checking the contrast now, and I'm going to make the trunk here darker, and this tree here too. I'm going to try to take advantage of the texture of the paper over here. I think I control a little bit more when I'm painting. But also, I've been painting for so long that I have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to get from the watercolor. I can negotiate with it. When I'm doing an illustration, I have to concern myself with its function as well. It's not just a matter of painting something beautiful. So in this case, I still have to have control, but in a different way because I have to work within a context. The plein air or the realistic stuff is different from the illustrations too. I don't have total control over what I'm painting right now. I intend to make this part wetter so that I can encourage more fusions, but I don't have absolute control of what's going to happen. There's a line here, but I'm not going to paint it directly. I want the paint to communicate and establish the gradation, the fusion. Sometimes I use this tool to recover the light in some parts. If you try to remove the paint when it's still wet, the paper underneath will still be kind of dark. But if the paint is a little dry, you might be able to flake it off. I probably would have painted the shadow first if the temperature was different, but they're about the same, so either way is fine. I joke that I should trademark my thumb and make a mold of it and sell it as a tool too, because I use my thumb to remove paint as well. I'm almost done. I'm just going to finalize some touches and then I'll do the last step, which is to apply the cast shadow from the trees. It's very dangerous to put my hand down here when it's still wet. So now the shadow on the back. Now I have to work on the shadow that is cast by the tree. So the shadow is warmer at the top, then it gets cooler and cooler. This is a very important stage because I only want to paint the shadows once. I don't want to have to come back and add saturation or intensity later, so I have to be careful to do this in just one brush stroke. Here's why it's important to work when the paper is still wet, because now I can connect the warmer parts with the cooler parts. Now I'm going to dry the painting and show you how you can use opaque paint to bring the light back. This can be a technique to bring back some elements you might have lost in the painting process. First, I'm going to darken some parts to get a little more variation in lighting. Then I'm going to use the opaque paint to bring the light back. But if I think that the lighting represented already on the painting is enough, I might just leave it since I don't necessarily have to copy the photo so exactly. You don't always have to put the same weight on your painting because photos usually make everything homogeneous. Just a bit of water on your brush when it's really dry can help simulate the texture of the light coming through. This is titanium white watercolor. I prefer titanium white over china white because of its consistency. Painting with china white feels almost like painting with toothpaste. Notice here that I'm not using pure white. I always try to add in a bit of color, like in this case, green and yellow. I try to be very careful about applying opaque white. It's very tempting because it's so simple, but I'm very selective about using it, and even when I do, I try to be very disciplined about it. With the red gate over here, you can see the reference has more detail. But I feel that the stain in the paint is already very informative. More detail wouldn't add anything to my painting. This is why I break down those exercises with monochromatic gradients and do studies with no saturation or color. Those are just step-by-step exercises that help you get used to the behavior of watercolor, so that in the end you can put everything together into a beautiful painting. When you're done, put the reference away. Once you have your painting, the reference no longer exists.
Final lesson. You've made it. Now it's time for the homework. So this homework is going to be a lot of rich, saturated colors in these photos. We're going to step up the challenge a little bit more. So good luck and have fun. You made it. What a wonderful class. I hope you had as much fun as I have. It's changed my life, honestly. If it's changed yours, definitely give him a shout and let him know. Otherwise, thank you so much for letting Carcamo be one of your little steps along your artistic journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am happy.